They were the kind of neighbors you'd pass on the street and never look at twice. Friendly, perhaps. A little rough around the edges. But no one would have imagined the truth. Not even close. Because behind the walls of 25 Cromwell Street, Fred and Rose West were building a house of horrors. One body at a time. It would take 2 decades, whispers from the missing, and a desperate escape to finally unearth what had festered in silence. It began with a girl. A teenager, frightened and trembling, clutching a police officer's coat in the pouring rain. Her name was Heather West. Or rather, it should have been. But Heather had vanished. And no one, not even her siblings, dared to ask where she'd gone. In their house, questions were dangerous. Silence was survival. But someone finally spoke. Her younger sister, her voice barely audible, told authorities that Heather hadn't run away. She was under the patio. Buried in the backyard. Dad said, she'd been a bad girl. That's why. It was just a whisper. But that whisper would open the gates of one of the most disturbing murder sprees in British history. Fred West was already broken long before he met Rose. A man molded in violence and raised on secrets. His childhood in Herefordshire was filled with whispered incest and parental abuse. As a teenager, Fred suffered a head injury in a motorcycle crash. After that, his behavior grew darker. Obsessive. Twisted. By the time he was 20, he'd already served time for theft. And worse. But when he met Rosemary Letts, a 15-year-old with her own troubled history, something ignited between them. Not love. Something darker. Like 2 halves of a broken mirror locking into place. Rose had been described as moody, volatile. She hated her strict home life, her schizophrenic mother, her domineering father. So when she met Fred, charming, older, rebellious, she fell hard. They moved in together quickly. Too quickly. Within months, they were living in a caravan, and Rose was pregnant. What happens when 2 predators find each other? What happens when abuse becomes a shared language? Fred and Rose weren't just partners in life. They became partners in murder. The first known victim wasn't a stranger. It was Fred's stepdaughter, Charmaine, the child of his previous wife, Rena. When Rena left Fred and tried to reclaim her daughter, she vanished. Just like that. Gone. Later, Rose would claim she walked out. But the truth was darker. Charmaine, barely 8 years old, had been beaten for months. Neighbors would later recall seeing her with bruises, black eyes. Then, one day, she disappeared. Fred and Rose told everyone she'd gone back to her mother. But years later, her skeletal remains were found buried under a kitchen floor in an earlier home in Gloucester. She was found with her jaw still clenched tight. Fred liked to bury secrets beneath his feet. But the ground only hides so much, for so long. Their house at 25, Cromwell Street wasn't just a home. It became a trap. Fred and Rose opened their doors to young women, often vulnerable or estranged from their families. Some were hitchhikers. Others were looking for cheap rent. All were promised safety. But the moment they stepped through that door, they were in the West's world. Fred would lure them in. Rose would calm their nerves. Then the door would lock behind them. Some were tied up. Others drugged. Many were tortured. Few ever saw daylight again. Inside the home, their children learned never to speak. Rose, often more violent than Fred, ruled with fists and belts. The younger ones learned fast. You don't cry. You don't ask about the screams in the basement. And you never, ever mention Heather. Heather had been spirited. Defiant. The only one brave enough to challenge them. And in the summer of 1987, she vanished. Fred told the younger kids she'd run off to work at a holiday camp. That she was trouble anyway. But sometimes, late at night, he'd laugh to himself and say, she's under the patio, where she belongs. At the time, no one thought to dig. What does it take for a child to turn in their own parents? More than fear. It takes terror. And a sliver of hope. It was Heather's disappearance that finally cracked the facade. The younger children, after years of quiet torment, began to whisper. Social services caught wind. Police were brought in. The stories sounded absurd. Even delusional. But something in the details made investigators pause. Enough to get a warrant. Enough to dig. What they found was just the beginning. Bones don't lie. And neither does concrete when it starts to crack. It began with a shallow dig under the patio, the one Fred used to joke about. The one Heather was supposedly buried beneath. Officers didn't expect to find anything that first day. But the moment the soil gave way to something harder, everything changed. What they uncovered wasn't just bones. It was evidence of a secret life, one carefully constructed over years, maybe decades. As investigators pulled the first human remains from the ground, it was clear this wasn't a missing person case. This was something else. Something monstrous. Fred was brought in for questioning. At first, he played the innocent father. Confused. Concerned. Then, strangely cooperative. He offered them a deal. He said, "If I show you where they are, you'll leave Rose out of it, right?" The detectives didn't respond. Fred smiled, leaned back, and began to talk. What followed was a chilling tour of his own backyard. With almost no emotion, Fred pointed to where Heather was buried. Then to another spot. And another. He knew exactly where to dig, down to the foot. Within days, police had uncovered 3 sets of human remains in the garden alone. But Fred wasn't done. He started talking about others. Girls who'd stayed in the house. Girls who came for a room or a job. He never called them victims. He never used their names. Just the others. He told them to look under the cellar floor. To rip up the concrete slab near the stairs. He told them where the bones were, because he'd put them there himself. In total, 9 bodies were discovered in and around the home. All young women. All buried in various stages of decomposition. Some were dismembered. Others showed signs of extreme torture. One still had tape over her mouth. And then Fred went quiet. When detectives asked about the rest, about Charmaine, about Rena, about the others who'd vanished from earlier addresses, he clammed up. Claimed he couldn't remember. Claimed they were long gone. But behind the scenes, the forensic team was already digging. And they weren't just finding bones. They were finding signatures. Ligatures. Gags. Scattered jewelry. Hair still caught in duct tape. All buried with the victims like twisted trophies. This wasn't just killing. This was ritual. And still, Rose said nothing. For days, she denied everything. Said she knew nothing. That Fred had tricked her too. She played the grieving wife. The shocked mother. But one of the children, now grown, came forward with something that shattered her story. He said, she was worse than Dad. He remembered screams in the night. Remembered Rose bringing girls into the house, laughing with them, then locking the door behind her. He remembered Heather begging for help. Remembered the bruises. The shouting. The silence that always followed. Police searched the house again, this time focusing on Rose's bedroom. Beneath her mattress, they found graphic photographs. Undisclosed to the public, too disturbing for court. But what was clear was this: she wasn't just a bystander. She was a participant. Fred was charged with 11 counts of murder. Rose with 10. And then something strange happened. Fred changed his story. Now, he said Rose had nothing to do with it. That he'd acted alone. That he was protecting her. But detectives didn't buy it. They'd heard too much. Seen too much. And they weren't the only ones. Inside the holding cell, Fred began to unravel. The swagger disappeared. The charm turned cold. He asked for paper. A pen. and in the early hours of January 1st, 1995, he wrote a short, emotionless note to Rose. It read simply, "We'll be together again when it's all over." Then he took a piece of bedding, tied it to a window grate in his cell, and hanged himself. Fred West was dead. But the story was far from over. Now all eyes turned to Rose. Without Fred, her trial would become the centerpiece of the entire case. Survivors were called to testify, former lodgers, children, even neighbors who'd heard things but said nothing. One by one, they painted a picture of a woman more terrifying than her husband. Cold, controlling, and utterly remorseless. One child described seeing Rose kick a pregnant woman in the stomach until she collapsed. Another recalled being forced to watch as Rose abused one of the girls tied to the bed. There was no doubt anymore, this wasn't a story of one man's evil. It was a partnership. A marriage built on blood. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Rose never cried. Never apologized. Never explained. When the verdict came in, guilty on all 10 counts of murder, she didn't flinch. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, she has never admitted guilt. Never shown remorse. She remains at HMP Newhall, silent behind steel doors, her past sealed in concrete and bones. But the shadows of 25, Cromwell Street linger. After the investigation ended, the house was demolished. The ground flattened. Nothing remains of the property where so many lost their lives. But for those who survived, the trauma lives on. One of the children once said, "We grew up thinking that kind of pain was normal. That silence was survival." It wasn't until years later that they realized they had lived in the center of one of the most horrific crimes in British history. Fred and Rose West didn't just kill. They buried innocence. One body at a time. In courtrooms or news reports, but in the minds of a public still trying to understand how two people could carry out such cruelty for so long, without being stopped. It wasn't just about the murders. It was the silence. The unanswered knocks at doors. The missing persons reports that gathered dust. The social workers who came close, but didn't push far enough. The neighbors who heard something, but chose not to hear it again. Cromwell Street became a symbol, not just of horror, but of institutional failure. And the children, those who survived, were left to pick up the shattered pieces of what they thought was a family. One daughter, years later, would give an interview. Her voice was soft, controlled. But beneath it, decades of buried screams. "We didn't know what love was," she said. "We didn't even know what normal was. We were taught to hide bruises before we could spell our own names." Another child, now in adulthood, spoke about the day the police finally came. "It was the first time I ever felt safe," he said. "And the first time I realized, we'd been living in a cage." Psychologists who studied Fred and Rose tried to understand the root of their sadism. Was it upbringing? Brain trauma? Mutual reinforcement? Or something worse, something unexplainable? Fred was often described as manipulative, charming even. He could joke with investigators one minute, then recall the mutilation of a victim the next. He seemed to lack any concept of remorse, his actions justified, even necessary, in his mind. Rose, on the other hand, was colder. More detached. While Fred sought attention, Rose sank into silence. But those who examined her patterns saw something chilling, a need for control. A hunger to dominate. She wasn't just complicit, she was active. In some cases, more sadistic than Fred himself. And together, they became a storm. Experts believe that the relationship between the two didn't just enable their crimes, it escalated them. Fred brought the fantasies. Rose brought the fury. And when they fed off each other, the line between thought and action disappeared. But even as the world tried to psychoanalyze them, the victims, those buried and those who lived, remained the center of the story. Each recovered body represented not just a murder, but a life that had been erased. A daughter. A sister. A friend. Women like Lucy Partington, a gifted student abducted on her way home for Christmas. Or Shirley Robinson, who was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child when she was killed and buried in the garden. Some victims have never been conclusively identified. Some never will be. And to this day, authorities believe there may be more. More victims. More secrets. More horrors lost to time. Fred once hinted in passing to others, buried far away. But he took those names to the grave with him. And Rose has never spoken of them. For years, police reviewed cold cases, matching Fred's construction work across the UK with disappearances that aligned with his movements. Dozens of families hoped, dreaded, that one of those names might surface. That some part of their long-lost daughter might finally be found. But silence lingers. In 1996, 25, Cromwell Street was demolished brick by brick. The site was flattened, paved over. The government wanted to erase it, to take away the pilgrimage spot it had become for the morbidly curious. In its place, a simple path. No signs. No plaque. No reminder. But some things you can't bury. The story lives on in the minds of millions. In documentaries. In books. In whispered warnings passed through generations. And for the survivors, their story didn't end in court. Some changed their names. Moved away. Tried to rebuild. Others entered therapy programs for years, struggling to form relationships, battling trauma no child should ever carry. One child, in a letter to a therapist, wrote, "I still wake up in the middle of the night and expect to hear her footsteps on the stairs. I'm 38. But part of me is still that 7-year-old, hiding under the bed." These were the echoes left behind. Not just the bodies, but the aftermath. The ripples of evil that stretch beyond death. Fred and Rose West weren't monsters in a fairy tale. They were real. Ordinary in appearance. Unremarkable in every way, until you looked closer. And that's what makes their story so terrifying. Because they didn't live in the shadows. They were the couple down the street. The ones who smiled as they passed you. The ones who said don't worry. The ones whose windows were always drawn, whose basement door was always locked. You never really know what goes on behind closed doors. And sometimes, when you finally open them, it's already too late.